So now we're going to be looking at the for each method, which is another really useful function that's on the array prototype. Basically, this can be a replacement for a traditional while or for loop, where when you need to loop over every element of an array, you need to run some code or call a function, etc. It just makes the code a little bit cleaner if you use a for each versus using a for loop. So the gist of this function is, again, it's going to take a callback as the first required argument, and then a context is an additional optional argument if you want to. Basically, it's going to call the callback or invoke the callback for every value that's in your array. It's always going to return undefined, so don't expect the for each method to give you back anything useful. One thing that you should note is that there's no way to break out of the for each loop once it starts, right? So in some traditional cases where you loop over an array and then you find an element and you want to stop the loop or break or continue, you can't do that. It's just going to do every single value and call the callback unless you decide to throw an exception. But even on the docs, they say this is not a good approach. Use a different approach if you plan to break out early during your looping. And then lastly, your callback arguments are just going to be very similar to map or filter, where you have the value is the first argument, the index is the second argument, and the original array is the third argument. So because this function kind of just does what a traditional for loop might do, I'm not going to be covering too many examples with it. The one example we're going to look at, though, is just how do we print out every element that's in the array using a for each loop. And then you should be able to kind of be creative and figure out what you could use a for each loop for later on. So in this example, we have an array of 4 elements with the values 1, 2, 3, 4. And for every element, we just want to print out what the value is to the console. So similar to the other functions that take a callback, such as filter or map, we need to provide it an ES6 fat arrow, or any type of function, I should say, where the first argument is going to be the value that we want. And then I'm going to do a fat arrow. And then if I just want to print out the value of everything that's in the array, I could just do a console log here. Bear with me really quick. So console log, and then I'll pass it the v argument. That should be the value of what we're trying to look at. So then if I just step through this really quick, we're first going to loop over at index 0, and that's going to look at the value 1. So we have 1 here, and it's just going to run whatever command or function or block that you have here. So in this case, it's just going to print 1 out to the console. And then we're going to move on to the next index, which is index 1, value 2. We look at the value 2 here, it's going to run into our console log, and then that's going to print out to our console. And we're just going to pretend like this is my console right here. And then we increment again. We're at index 2, value 3. We're just going to call whatever block code or function here is. So console log of 3 is going to print out 3 to the console. And then finally, at the very end of this for each loop, we're just going to look at the last index, which is value 4. And of course, this is going to print out to the console. So there's really nothing that's too complicated about this. Basically, it's just a traditional for loop, but it just is written in a more concise way to just call a callback function every time you hit an element in the array. So let's move on to jsbin and look at a couple of examples. So this is the exact same example that we did on the whiteboard, where we have an array of 1, 2, 3, 4, and for each value in that array, we just print it out. So if I run this, notice that we get back 1, 2, 3, and 4. So some things I'll just kind of do to point out is you can't skip or break out of this loop. So if I try to do break here, it's not going to do anything. In fact, it's going to give an error. You can't use continue in here. That's not going to do anything. The only way, like they said, is you'd have to throw a custom exception if you wanted to break out early. But again, they recommend that you shouldn't even be using a for each loop if you need to break out. To demonstrate what is returned, I can set the return value of for each to this ret variable, and I can print it out. And notice that we get undefined printed out for this variable. So just note that for each is always going to return undefined. There's nothing useful it returns. Some additional things that I could try to cover is the additional arguments. If you remember, the callback is going to take a value, going to take an index, and it's going to take the original array here. So value, index, if I were to print this out, notice that we get um, 1 and 0, 2 and 1, 3 and 2, 4 and 3.